Today's topic for discussion is types of bark on the basis of morphology. The bark is a protective layer of the stem. It is corky, suberized layer which is formed by the secondary meristem. All the cells situated outside the phylogeny die, forming the bark of the stem. If the phylogeny is deep, the cells of the cortex and phloem may be involved. The phylogeny divides and redivides, producing cells and which become suberized. It is the mass of dead cells and in the form of hard layer. It protects the inner region and prevents transpiration. The bark is the external part of the stem of the large trees and shrubs, which is protective in function. It is one of the key factors which is useful in identification of the trees. It has a characteristic odor. Bark has a characteristic texture, color, and arrangement of cells. The bark is made up of dead cells, that is sclerenchymatous tissue. Hence, it is protective in function. It protects the underlying tissue from drought, insects, and any other mechanical agency. The tree species of deciduous forest is one of the best places to study the great variation among variation of the bark. According to its appearance, the bark is described in various ways such as scaly bark, cracked bark, smooth bark, peeling bark, furrowed bark, etc. The bark of the tree or shrubs is described in various ways according to its appearance. Some of the types of barks are described here, and let us discuss about the types of bark. Number 1, next slide. Ring bark. The stem possesses periderm which occurs in successive concentric rings. Such structure of bark is described as ring bark. Scaly bark. Next, scaly bark. When the stem possesses patches of the bark is termed as scaly bark. The scaly bark is formed discontinuous overlapping successive periderm on the stem of the tree. Next, featured bark. Next slide. Featured bark. The bark is like a net. It is thick. After full maturity of the stem, bark of the tree split open in this way, which looks like a net. The featured bark consists of secondary phloem fibers in the inner bark, and the secondary fibers are also termed as blast fibers. Featured bark is highly protective in function. The example is bark of the ficus. Next, smooth bark. In certain plants, the bark of the stem is smooth in touch. Mostly these are smooth in touch, but the texture of the bark is such type of structure that is described as smooth bark. Next, cracked bark. The bark is protective layer of the stem. Already I told you. The bark is an outermost layer. The bark split open due to stretching force which occur during growth of the parental stem in its diameter. The bark split open or get cracked in vertical and horizontal manner. Such bark is described as cracked bark. Next, the laminate bark. The bark of the tree split open in the form of thin plate-like pieces. Such bark is described as laminate bark. Next, grainy bark. The bark appear grainy, grey colored, sometimes scaly grainy, as in Albizia lebec. Next, Fishy bark. A finely splitting bark approximately in regular and vertical manner is described as Fishy bark. Next type of bark, that is exfoliating bark or peeling bark. The bark partially peeled off from the parental stem in the form of scales or layers. The scales or layers of the bark may be thin. In this case, the thick-walled cells are alternating with the thin-walled cells. Such type of bark is described as exfoliating bark. Next, The fumigenous bark. The thick or thin smoky colored bark is described as fumigenous bark. Mostly the fumigenous bark does not show cracking. Next, winged bark. The bark is termed as winged when it is rigid but horizontal projections of the bark appear from parental stem which resemble the wings of the bird. Such type of bark is described as wing bark. Next, shreddy bark. The bark at maturity peeled off in the form of ribbon or elongated fragments. Such type of bark is described as shreddy bark. Okay, next, plated bark. The bark of the tree split off from the parental stem in the form of flat, plate-like structures and or dish-like structures, and such type of bark is described as plated bark. Okay. Next, fatiscent bark. In this case, the bark shows more cracking and falling apart, and such type of bark is described as fatiscent bark. Okay. Next, these are the photographs of different types of bark, and the first photograph, that is the bark of Acacia nilotica. Second photograph, bark of Dalonyx regia. Third photograph, bark of Acacia longifolia. Fourth, bark of the Polyanthia longifolia. And fifth photograph, that is bark of Bombax mulbericum. And next, bark of Cocos nucifera. Last photograph, it is the bark of Azadiracta indica. All the trees is having a different types of bark, and bark, even the color of the bark is different, texture of the bark is different, chemically the barks are different, and chemical content is different, and all these are the characteristic features of the bark. They can play a very important role in identification of the plant. Thank you very much. Save trees, save earth.